Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupini avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So, this is class 4 of the class Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. I promise we'll eventually get to the Bhagavad Gita. We're not there yet. But as I've been assuring you, there's a method to our madness here. So in the past couple classes, we've been discussing traditional schools of Vedanta and their main doctrines. What was the purpose of that? Because we'll eventually be sometimes consulting traditional commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, like Shankara's commentary, like Ramanuja's commentary. In order to understand those commentaries, we need to, you can go around too, anyone who wants, yeah. In order to understand those commentaries, we have to have some rudimentary understanding of their respective philosophical worldviews. That was the purpose of the previous homework assignment. Now, the current homework assignment, the new one for this class, and probably for the next class, is chapter 1 of a book I wrote, published in 2018, called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. I assigned chapter 1, so that's going to be the focus of today's class and probably the next class, because I don't want to rush it. What's the topic of this chapter? The topic is, what exactly is Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? It's a huge question, opens multiple cans of worms. There have been many different answers to the question. That's partly what I discuss in this chapter, and I defend a certain interpretation of his philosophy. Why is that relevant to an understanding of the Bhagavad Gita? I'm asking. So anyone?
Well, if it's in light of Sri Ramakrishna, then we have to know what his philosophy was.
Exactly. Because if we're trying to study the Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, we better know what the heck Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy is, right? Okay. But before we get into the chapter, I wanted to make a few announcements. Number 1, I'm going to be traveling for the next few days. I'm going to the East Coast. So the next class will be 17th September, Sunday, 9:30 to 10:30 a.m. as usual, but that means we're skipping a week. And we're most likely going to be, I'm not even most likely, we are going to continue discussing this chapter, so there's no new homework assignment. But this is academic writing, and it's challenging and dense. And so I'd recommend at least that you, if you have some time, reread the chapter, or at least parts of the chapter, because it'll help your understanding. Okay, so that's the first thing. Number 2, I said this once or probably twice, but I'm going to say it a third time. This is an academic course, so please treat it like an academic course, which means that there's going to be homework assignments for every single class. And the class is based on the homework assignment, which means the homework you do for that week in the next class will be discussing that homework assignment. So unless you do the homework assignment, this whole class it's going to be pointless. So this is not a typical YouTube spiritual discourse which involves passive listening and let the words flow through you and over you and under you. And, it's like you're sunbathing and you're just... No! I want you to be active learners, active thinkers, critical thinkers, ask questions, challenge me. That's the purpose of this course. So it's a different kind of course, and I'm telling specifically online people. My father watches online, and I'm just putting my dad on the spot here. So he said, yeah, I like the class, but I didn't follow it. I said, did you do the homework? No. He says, well, how do you expect to follow it if you don't do the homework? So do the homework. Okay, all right, that's number 2. That's the screed. Do your homework. Third, a few people watching online have been asking me whether there's a way for them to ask questions. Now, that's a little tricky because we're not live streaming this course. We're uploading the course a day later. But here's my suggestion. For anyone online who wants to pose a question, please post the question in the YouTube comments section of the class on which you want to ask the question. Preface your question with the word question in all caps. Question, all caps. so that you flag it as a question, because me or whoever I'm going to ask to do this, I don't want them to have to sift through every single comment. Make it obvious that it's a question. So all caps question, colon, and please make sure your questions are to the point, that they're succinct, that they're directly related to the topic of that class, and I want to see that the question reflects that you've done your homework. And if I can tell that this is a question coming from nowhere and that you just randomly happened upon this video without doing anything ahead of time, I'm almost certainly not going to answer your question. And if the question is weird or not directly relevant to what we're talking about in the class, I'm probably not going to answer your question. So the better your question, the more relevant it is, the more succinct it is, the more likely it is that I will answer the question. What I'll try to do then is try to answer a few of the questions in the subsequent class. I'll leave some time out to answer those questions, okay? That's my hope. Okay, so now let's get started because there's a lot to talk about. So, chapter 1 of Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. So what is exactly Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? Big question. And in the introduction to this chapter, I lay out what I consider to be the three main approaches to Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. Let's see how well you've done your homework. What's the first main approach to Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, Sri Ramakrishna's teachings? What's the first interpretive approach? Anyone? We've got a room full of people here.
I mean, like
they're like
how he sees karma and
no. There are three camps, interpretive camps in understanding Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. Okay. I divide it into three camps. What is the first camp?
Oh, M's?
That falls under it, but it's a broader. You're on the right track.
Vishaddvaita?
Well, that's part of it, but then there are other. Yeah, you're not wrong, but you're not fully right either.
Okay.
Because the first camp is not just Vishishtadvaita, it's broader than that. So now think about it.
Okay.
Anyone?
All of Advaita?
His upbringing?
No.
Oh, Bhakti.
Okay, now we're just... Hold on. Let me point to the page number, and then we'll... Okay. Basically, it's the first page of the chapter. What, Chinmay? Try it.
They put it to a specific sect.
Exactly.
That's what I just said.
No, you said only Vishishtadvaita.
Is what M thinks is
Yeah.
Ramakrishna's philosophy.
Right.
We're just going one at a time.
Okay, all right. So Chinmay is correct and Niranjana is sort of correct. Okay, so the first camp interprets Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy like the first page of the chapter. It's page 13. The first camp interprets Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy through a particular sectarian lens. Through a particular sectarian lens. Be that lens Advaita, Vishishtadvaita, Tantra, Vaishnavism, the list goes on. That's the point. It's not just a Vishishtadvaitic interpretation or just a classical Advaitic interpretation or just a Tantric. All of those are covered by the first camp.
Oh, I see.
You see, that's the key. Now, let me give you a sense here. So, for instance, classical Advaita Vedanta. This is probably the most common interpretation, sectarian interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Who are some of these? Jaima. Be careful about the chords so you can, just kind of go around.
Yeah, any of us can think he's any of the sects depending on what our flavor is.
Yeah, and that's what often happens is that whichever way you lean, you want Sri Ramakrishna to lean with you.
And he can.
And so, we have a lot of classical Advaitins in our monastic order, and so lo and behold, they tend to interpret Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy through the lens of classical Advaita Vedanta. Who are some of these people? Swami Omkarananda, a former vice president of our order, very scholarly monk. Swami Dhireshananda, another very scholarly monk of our order. There's a great scholar, not like a householder scholar, also named Dinesh Chandra Bhattacharya. He also interprets Sri Ramakrishna in this way. Now, the only problem is if you're interested in reading this classical Advaitic interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, the one difficulty is that it's all written in Bengali. So unless you know Bengali, it's not accessible to you. But it's very interesting stuff, especially Omkarananda and Dhireshananda's these articles. But I'm just flagging that a lot of the best scholarship interpreting Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy from a classical Advaita Vedantic standpoint is written in Bengali. And I have all the references. You can see footnote 2 on page 13. They're all there. Okay. And as Niranjana pointed out, another one who falls under this first camp was M, the author of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita. Because there's a very interesting section of the Gospel, of the Kathamrita, not in the Gospel. Why is it not in the Gospel? Because Nikalanji omits the entire section, where M says, I don't think Sri Ramakrishna was a follower of Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta, because he does not dismiss this world as Maya, as unreal. I think he was a follower of Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita philosophy. M says this. He himself writes it. He doesn't put words into Sri Ramakrishna's mouth. He's saying, this is my view. And so that's why I place M under this camp as well. A prominent Western scholar in 1976, his name was Walter Neville. He published an important article on Sri Ramakrishna, where he claims that Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy is best understood as Tantra. It's Tantric philosophy. Why? It's like a 50-page article, and he makes an impressive case for it. He quotes Sri Ramakrishna saying Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, that reality which is Nirguna is also Saguna, Shakti has become everything in this world. And he points out how this aligns very nicely with Tantric philosophy. So he also falls under this first camp. You see?
Now I see why you're
Yeah,
saying
so
all
that's
of it.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So all of these count as falling under the first camp. What characterizes this first camp is any sectarian interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. Okay. Second main camp. Anyone want to take a stab at what the second main approach to Sri Ramakrishna's teachings are?
Through Swami Medhananda's complete works.
No. Okay, now you're just guessing.
You asked me to guess, I guess.
Okay, no. After doing the homework, you missed the long lecture I gave on how the importance of doing homework.
Consistent, that part?
Yeah. So what's
That's the
try to put in your own
Any
words. The
coherent
second camp.
philosophy.
What does the second camp represent? How do they approach Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? Page 14. It's just two paragraphs. Come on, guys. Come on, guys.
Devotionalism and spirituality became enchanting.
Put it in your own
Willing
words.
in his God consciousness.
Okay, you're just reading out my words. That doesn't impress me. So tell me simply in one sentence.
My
Yeah.
second guess.
Okay.
People who are fanatical about Sri Ramakrishna and they don't really put him in any school of philosophy, and then they just take what he says uncritically.
Well,
Devotional,
Oh,
sentimental.
I see.
sort of,
He's
but
a
not really.
universalist, a generalist, like
Sort
that.
of.
Like they say he has no real claim or stance on anything.
Okay.
He's just kind of
Okay, I'm gonna because it's okay. I'm a little worried about you guys because you claim to have done the homework, but okay. Let's look at page 14, and I'm just gonna read out to you the first full paragraph. Rejecting all such efforts to classify Sri Ramakrishna as the flag bearer of a particular sectarian school, meaning rejecting that first camp. Narasingha Sil, somebody who represents what I consider the second camp, argues that Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical views are unsystematic and even inconsistent, so the very attempt to derive any coherent philosophical position from his teachings is doomed to fail. As Narasingha Sil puts it, there is no, quote, consistency in Ramakrishna's devotionalism or spirituality because he was so enchantingly freewheeling in his God consciousness. That's the second camp. It means let's not try to paint him as something that he's not. He dropped out of school at age 6. And so why do we expect to find some sophisticated, coherent philosophical framework from his teachings? No. He was a simple devotee. He was a great mystic. Let him be him. And let's not bother to figure out some coherent philosophy on the basis of his teachings. Do you follow? This is the second approach. And another scholar I put under this category is Omyo Shen. I discussed that in, in the footnote, I think, yeah. Well, footnote 6 on page 14, if you're interested. So, but I don't want to dwell too long on that. So that's the second camp. Now, before we get to the third camp, I want to ask you, do you agree with either of these two camps? Yes or no? Why or why not?
Yes.
Let's talk about the first camp. Yeah, which one?
So I'm in the first camp.
Okay, why?
Right. And I think Sri Ramakrishna is not Kashmir Shaiva, but a Kaulatrika
Uh-huh.
Tantric. And on the same basis as what you claim in this book. So what you're calling Vijñānavada,
You
I
call...
would argue with Kaulatrika Tantra in
Okay.
its depth and breadth and scope.
Right, okay. So some people will say, Nishant is saying that I agree with the first camp, the sectarian group, and I think that Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy is best understood in terms of Kaula Tantra. Is that
Kaulatrika.
Kaula Trika Tantra? Okay. Anyone else? What?
Yeah, both. I mean, I could be in either
Both camps.
camp.
Because sometimes when I feel very tantric, I'm
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, he totally. I mean,
Yeah.
he literally was.
But then sometimes when any way I want to be, however my mood is,
Yeah.
there's some part of him that serves that for me in that moment.
Okay.
But then it could feel very freewheeling because he did,
Mm-hmm.
But I've already read the chapter.
Oh, so that's she's done her homework, and so she knows what's coming. Okay, anyone else want to defend either of the two first camps before we get into the third, which I obviously end up defending?
I'm in the same boat with Nishan.
Okay, but your sect is different, I bet.
Similar, but...
So go ahead, explain it.
Tantra.
Devi Tantra.
Yes, and Shakta. From my understanding of reading Ramakrishna, he started off historically as a tantric and took to a tantric teacher for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
But within that, the way I understand it, Sri Ramakrishna is attempting to make everything flat instead of a hierarchical process.
Yeah, correct.
There's an attempt to
Correct.
level the playing field instead of a hierarchy.
Correct. But do you find a hierarchy or a level playing field in Tantra, the traditional tantric texts?
I honestly feel that it's a level playing field.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you feel, Nishant?
There's a
You've
hierarchy.
studied a lot of tantric texts.
There's a hierarchy of revelation.
Yeah. So,
Yes.
but do you find that in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings?
A hierarchy of revelation. Yes, that Vijñāna comes after.
Oh, I see. So you're saying that you find a similar kind of hierarchy even in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings.
Not a hierarchy, not doxographical hierarchy.
But do you find that in Tantra?
No. So that's the thing. I think Tantra Loka, Book 3, verse 4 or 5, that argues that it doesn't matter what you call the principle, as long as you recognize that Brahma or Shakti are Ved in so many ways.
That's fine, but I think then you get in the nitty-gritty of different figures within tantric traditions and different texts.
That's why.
Pratyabhijñā has pretty clear philosophical doxography,
in
right?
Verse, that verse.
Doxography is a fancy term for higher and lower, and so it's like a kind of categorization of different philosophical views in a hierarchical manner. And often they start with Charvaka, which means the gross materialist viewpoint, which is that the Vedas are nothing but the ravings of lunatics. That's a literal quotation from the Charvaka literature. And then you slowly work your way up to more spiritual philosophies. Lo and behold, culminating in the case of a tantric doxographer, Tantra. In the case of an Advaita Vedantic doxographer, Advaita Vedanta. Everybody will put their own philosophy on top.
Isn't that what we're about to be doing right now with
I think
the
Vis-a-vis
third
what?
camp?
Well, I'm saying it's better than the other ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, but on the basis of evidence, and they're going to give evidence too. I mean, they're going to say that. Yeah. So Okay. So, anyone else want to take it? Nobody's defending the second camp. A couple of people are defending the tantric interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. So that's interesting. Okay. So now, the third camp. This is the camp that I place myself in, and I claim, and this is highly controversial, that Swami Medhananda belongs to this camp. I wrote an entire book defending that view. That's the next book that was published last year, Swami Medhananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, because it's such a controversial issue. So that's controversial. I think less controversial is that I claim that Swami Turiyanandaji, another direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, belongs to this third camp. What is the third camp? I call it the non-sectarian approach to Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. You cannot pigeonhole Sri Ramakrishna into any particular sect. The main reason being that because he embraced all sects. So if you embrace all sects, the moment you put him in one sect, he's not able to fully embrace the other sects as well. That's because that's by definition what a sect is that it distinguishes itself from another sect. So that's one of the reasons. And then there are a number of other reasons we'll find in the course of the chapter. And there are a number of more recent scholars who belong to this camp. One is Satish Chandra Chatterjee, a great Bengali philosopher from the 20th century, who wrote a book called Classical Indian Philosophies, their synthesis in the philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna. And the last chapter, it's a big 50-page chapter, around 50 pages, and it's called The Philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna. He provides a very sophisticated, non-sectarian interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy based on Vijñāna. So it's I draw on his work, and I kind of develop it further. Swami Tapasyananda, one of the few monks in our order who also defends this Vijñāna-grounded, Vijñāna-based interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna as a non-sectarian thinker. So I have all the references in the footnotes in page 15 and 16, if you're interested in studying this more deeply. So it takes me the entire chapter to defend my non-sectarian approach. And so I suggest that we begin to look at some of the evidence and assess it critically, and then you make up your own minds about which camp you belong to and why. But I humbly request you to, whatever your position is, defend it with evidence to the best of your ability. That's all, and don't get emotional about it. It's always a problem. Okay, now the third camp. I see. Why do I not agree with the first camp or the second camp? I don't agree with the first camp because I think that the moment you place Sri Ramakrishna in a particular sect, you're not taking the whole of him. You have to lop off some part of him. It becomes Procrustean. Some limb, some aspect of his teaching or bhava is lost. And so I would disagree with you exegetically about Tantra. I think that there are strong hierarchical kind of elements in Tantric philosophy which are not present in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, but that can be argued. And so I suggest that I've been encouraging you to do your own scholarly writing, so that would be a wonderful project if you can do that. And the second camp, which we're sort of kind of gliding over, none of us seems to like the second camp. But the problem with it is that just because he didn't have a PhD doesn't mean that he's not a sophisticated philosophical thinker. It's crazy to think that, I think. And the proof is in the pudding. And so let's give him a chance and look at his teachings and see whether we can find a coherent philosophical thread running through it. And I think we can. That's at least the case I make in this chapter. What is the thread that brings together, that reconciles all of his seemingly disparate teachings? Answer? What's my answer to that question? Anybody who's read the chapter should be able to tell me. One-word answer. There should be a one-word answer. Very good. That, even without reading this. I know Neeraj hasn't done his homework, but that was such an obvious question that he gave the obvious answer.
Well, it was too obvious. It was making me think like, oh.
Yeah. So, no. So, yeah, I think that his teachings on Vijñāna give us the skeleton key for understanding all of his different philosophical teachings and relating them to one another in a coherent framework. That's why I'm emphasizing Vijñāna so much. Yeah. Okay? So, we have a little over a half hour. So what I think we should do is discuss carefully the second section of chapter 1, starting on page 19. Because this section is very important. Before we actually get into the different philosophical doctrines, you can take a seat over there. Just go around, yeah. And you can sit in the front here if you want. Yeah, or anywhere. It's really getting packed here. Okay. Okay. Sri Ramakrishna did not write any philosophical treatises in the manner of other, traditional philosophers in the West or in the East. The document which is richest in his philosophical teachings is, of course, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. But ideally in the original Bengali, if you can read Bengali, Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita by M. And the thing is, that text is a record of his conversations with different visitors to Dakshineshwar. And they're just word for word, verbatim records of what he said during these conversations. So, that produces a distinctive difficulty. The difficulty is, how do we figure out what his own philosophical views were on the basis of these long conversations with many different people from all walks of life? Some were renunciates, some were householders, some were Advaita Vedantins, some were Brahma Samaj followers, some were Tantrics, some were Vaishnavas. How do we figure out what his view was? Because part of his genius, his spiritual genius and his intellectual genius, was that he was a chameleon. And he says, we'll talk about this later, but he says, everybody thinks I belong to their school.
Exactly.
And that's still true.
The first camp.
Yeah, and I really think Sri Ramakrishna back in the 1880s anticipated this first camp. He goes, I guarantee you that Nishant is going to interpret me as a Kaulatrika tantric, and that someone else.
Feels like he can fit
Yeah, but but the thing is, the problem with it is, how do you pin down the chameleon? How do you capture the chameleon not just as red or blue or yellow, but also as colorless and the whole kit and caboodle? the chameleon as the chameleon and all the colors and no color at all. That's what I'm trying to do. It's a difficult task. So I argue that in order to discern properly and accurately and rigorously a coherent philosophy on the basis of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings as found primarily in the Gautamrita, in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, we need to follow certain interpretive principles. Interpretive principles. What do I mean by interpretive principles? It means we follow certain principles in order to most accurately understand what Sri Ramakrishna is saying. That's all. I give 5 interpretive principles. Okay, so let's look at them one by one. Page 19, interpretive principle 1. Instead of appealing to external philosophical doctrines or frameworks, we should strive to understand Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical teachings on their own terms. And then I go on to explain this principle in some detail on the next page. But I'm not going to read through it, because ideally you've all read through it. Do people have a handle on this first interpretive principle? What do I mean?
Yeah, because the exegesis, eisegesis.
Eisegesis and exegesis.
Yeah.
Well, let's not fall into eisegesis.
Yeah.
What would be an example of taking an external philosophical doctrine and reading it into Sri Ramakrishna's teachings? Anyone?
Like bringing the snake and the rope thing, for example.
Wonderful.
Oh, that's a great example.
That's a very good example. Why is that a good example? Because Sri Ramakrishna not once in the course of 1,200 pages, or however many pages you have in the text, refers to the rope snake analogy. Not once. But I often hear it when people explain Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. They cart in the ropes and snakes. They cart in another favorite thing from Advaita Vedanta. You know what? Anyone else want to guess?
Clay pot?
That's a problem for Advaita Vedanta, actually, but because it implies the world is real. But no, there's another thing that they love to bring in when they're explaining Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. People who are fans of classical Advaita Vedanta. No, the two-tier ontology. Good guess, though.
Oh, yeah.
What's the two-tier ontology?
Oh, that the world doesn't exist but what we think it does.
But what are the two standpoints?
Oh.
Vyavaharika, Paramatma.
Vyavaharika, the empirical or transactional standpoint. According to classical Advaita, all of this is real. The chairs, you, the camera, the mic, everything. But with one caveat. From the empirical standpoint, from the Vyavaharika standpoint. But from the ultimate standpoint, the Paramatika standpoint, the only reality is non-dual, impersonal, pure consciousness. Non-dual Brahman. And I very frequently, when I've given up on this because I've realized it's pointless. In the past, I was naive enough to, when I first joined the order, to think that, we're all reading the gospel all the time. Let's talk about it. No, nobody wants to talk about it. Or when they do, they'll bring in these concepts that you don't find Sri Ramakrishna teaching. He doesn't once talk about this distinction, this two-tier ontology. He never once says, from the ultimate standpoint, Brahman alone is real. From the relative standpoint, all of this is real, as far as I can tell. But you can prove me wrong if you want. But it's frequently brought in. This two-tier ontology is frequently brought in to explain Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. What happens the moment you do that?
You're sectarian.
You become, you're pushing him in a classical Advaitic direction. That's fine if it's really there. But the thing is, you have to give evidence. So show that he subscribes to the two-tier ontology. That's all. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying give evidence for it. Very good. So let's be very careful to avoid eisegesis, which means reading in concepts, doctrines, frameworks from other philosophies, things that we just happen to like for whatever reason, and reading it into his teachings. Let's try to be immanent, which means internal to his own way of thinking, his own concepts, his own terms, his own analogies. He doesn't use rope snake, but he uses plenty of other analogies. Why not focus on the analogies he uses? Why not use his analogy when he explains how Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, and he says, like fire and its power to burn? Why do we need to bring the rope snake in? But in fact, one classical Advaitic sectarian commentator named Omkarananda, he has an entire article called Brahma Shakti Abhed, written in Bengali, where he brings in the rope and the snake. And he says, yes, what Sri Ramakrishna is saying, when he says that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, is that Brahman is the rope, and Shakti is the snake, which means what he's saying is that Shakti is unreal. From the ultimate standpoint.
Say about a snake and a coiled up snake.
Very good.
Yeah.
There are snakes in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. It's just that it's very different from the rope and the snake. He says that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable like what? Like a snake when it's stationary and when that same snake is wriggling around. So what does he mean? Shakti is the dynamic aspect of the infinite divine reality. When it creates, preserves, and destroys the universe, I call that divine reality Shakti. When it's nishkriya, inactive, then I call it non-dual Brahman. That's Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. And he uses his own analogies. Let's focus on his analogies. That's the first interpretive principle. I hope that's clear to everybody. Yeah. Second interpretive principle, extremely important. Extremely important. So we really need to dwell on this a little bit. Now going back to this book, I feel like I probably should have named the principles. That would have been easier than just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I would call this second principle the context principle. Page 21 now. What's the principle? The context of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical teachings often provides crucial insight into their meaning and status. Again, we have to go back to the fact that this is not a philosophical treatise or textbook written by Sri Ramakrishna. It's a record of his conversations. That means context becomes all important. So what are some aspects of context? Number one, with whom is he speaking? Who is the interlocutor? That's very important. Because depending on what standpoint they're coming from, Sri Ramakrishna knows where they're coming from. He knows whether the person is a Vaishnava Goswami or a follower of the Brahma Samaj or a follower of classical Advaita. Mohima Chakraborty is an example of a follower of classical Advaita. There are Shaktas who come. So he'll be speaking to them from their standpoint. There are Vaishnavas who come. Sorry, I said Vaishnava Goswami already. There are classical Advaitans like Mohima Chakraborty. There are many others. Okay, Brahma Samaj followers like Keshav Chandra Sen. There's Pratap Chandra Muzumdar and many others. Vijay Krishna Goswami, right? And what you'll find is that he does the same. He often does the same thing with all of these. He says it's wonderful, this path that you're following, but never say that my path alone is true. Yeah. And so he'll teach them. He'll correct their one-sidedness by giving them something that they don't necessarily find in their philosophy. But that means it's going to differ. He's going to tell the Vaishnava Goswami, it's wonderful that your Ishta Devata is Krishna, that you practice this Sakhi Bhava or this Mother Bhava, wonderful. But never for a moment say that your Krishna cannot also be Brahman, for instance, that it cannot be Nirguna, without attributes. He'll talk to a classical Advaita like Mohima Chakraborty. He knows their leanings. He knows that at the end of the day, from the ultimate standpoint, again, they bring in this two-tier ontology. From the ultimate standpoint, bhakti is that's not real. The personal God has to be transcended, all that stuff. He says, no. He says it directly to Mohima Chakraborty. We might talk about that later. He says that's wrong, because that's another form of fanaticism, to think that your view is higher than other people's and that it's ultimately canceled, that we have the lucid view and that other people are kind of groping in darkness or half-light. No, you follow your path, but never say that your path alone is the highest or the truest. And so he'll do this with all of his different interlocutors. That's the first kind of context. Second context, but I'm not going to go into all of them, but one that's really important is what I call the verbal cues. So this is the third full paragraph on page 21. The verbal cues Sri Ramakrishna uses to frame many of his teachings helps us to determine whether the teaching represents his own view or the view of another person or sect, which he may or may not accept. This is extremely important. This reminds me of a funny incident. A few years ago, one of my favorite Swamis was a very old Swami named Kalipada Maharaj. He was staying in Arogya Bhavan in Belurmat, which is our elderly home for Swamis who are very old. And so I'd visit him regularly. And he was a staunch follower of classical Advaita Vedanta, and he would always interpret Sri Ramakrishna's teachings through that lens. And so we would have these playful debates, because he knew I wrote this book, and so he would tease me about Vijñāna. And so he would say, how can you say Sri Ramakrishna was a Vijñāni? He says Shakti is not real. And I said, where does he say that, Maharaj? And he points to the page. I look up the page, and it says, Jnanis say that Shakti is unreal, but I say, and then he conveniently omits the next sentence. And so that's what I mentioned. We can look at let's look on page 21, kind of about 2/3 of the way down. In the entry from 26th October 1884, Sri Ramakrishna states, quote, in the light of Vedantic reasoning. Now here, when he uses the word Vedantic, he's specifically thinking of classical Advaita Vedanta. In the light of Advaita Vedantic reasoning, the world is illusory, unreal as a dream. The supreme soul is the witness of the three states of waking, dream, and deep sleep. If you stop there, you say, so Sri Ramakrishna is endorsing classical Advaita Vedanta, wonderful. But wait, shortly thereafter, Sri Ramakrishna asserts, quote, but for my part, I accept everything. Turiya, which means that fourth, the beyond. And also the three states of waking, dream, and deep sleep. I accept all three states. I accept all. Brahman, and also Maya, the universe, and its living beings. Then I say, notice that the thrice repeated verbal cue, I accept, and the but here, But also says contrast. I just told you one position. I don't accept that. This is my view. I accept clearly indicates that this teaching, and not the classical Advaita view he previously stated, represents the view he actually holds. So this is very important. What verbal cues does he use that might help us understand whether he's just explaining another person's view? He was he dropped out at age 6 from schooling, but he was a Shrutitha. That means he had a photographic memory. He could remember everything he heard. Plenty of pundits would come to him, read from scriptures. He was a genius. And it's mind-boggling if you read the gospel from cover to cover, how many different philosophical traditions he refers to, showing the subtlety of his understanding of Ramanuja's school, Shankara's school, Tantra, Vaishnavism, all these things. It's all there at his fingertips. And he's using all of them. But we have to be careful about, so it gets tricky because just because he refers to a school doesn't mean that he's a card-carrying member of that school. That comes up in one of the later interpretive principles, which hopefully we'll get to. Okay, so keep that in mind. Context is all important. Never take his teachings out of context. Always go back to the original context. If you don't know Bengali, find a Bengali or find somebody who knows Bengali to verify that it's actually what Sri Ramakrishna said. Because honestly, I'm telling you, if you look at the English translation, there are places where Niklanji will just use the wrong word, like a word like illusory. The world is illusory. Where Sri Ramakrishna in Bengali does not use the word mithya in that context. He says anitya, for instance, anitto, which means impermanent. Impermanent does not necessarily mean illusory. Ramanuja also accepts that this world is illusory, but he doesn't think that this world is unreal. You see, so people who don't know the original language are in a bit of a difficulty. If you don't have the time or the wherewithal to learn the original language, find somebody who knows the original language and consult with them. If you really want to be serious and deep, because otherwise you're going to be creating a storm out of a teacup. You might be like basing your entire case for Sri Ramakrishna was a tantric or an Advaitin on the basis of a statement he never made. And this happens. Okay. Third interpretive principle, top of page 22. We kind of already touched on this, but I'm just going to repeat it. Any adequate interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical teachings must take into account his avowed non-sectarianism, his Catholic acceptance of all sectarian views and religious faiths as effective spiritual paths. And this is the quotation that I'd mentioned earlier. Let me just read it to you, just below. I have practiced all the disciplines, Sri Ramakrishna says. I accept all paths. I respect the Shaktas, the Vaishnavas, and also the Vedantins. Therefore, people of all sects come here, and every one of them thinks that I belong to his school. I also respect the modern Brahmagyanis, the modern knowers of Brahman. It's a slight gentle poke at them, because most of them are not knowers of Brahman, but they're followers of the Brahma Samaj. That's what he's thinking of. Therefore, people of all sects come here, and every one of them thinks that I belong to his school. So see how canny he was in anticipating how all these different scholars are trying to claim him for their own. The Tantrics, the Advaita Vedantins, the Vaishnavas. Okay. So the fact that Sri Ramakrishna himself says again and again, I accept all paths, means, I think, that the moment you pigeonhole him in any one sect, that means that you're doing violence to his fundamentally non-sectarian spirit. Now, you could argue, for instance, that Tantra is itself non-sectarian, and then that's what I want to see evidence for. And then you might say that, well, there's some tantric texts or figures that are kind of less sectarian than others. But then you have to be honest about it and say, but there are other tantric figures or texts which are more sectarian. So then it becomes more kind of nuanced. And then you can say it's not tantra in general, but certain figures or certain texts within the tantric tradition, which I think come very close or are almost identical to Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. But that requires a lot of hard work and close analysis and reading, exegesis. Okay, interpretive principle 4. This is probably the trickiest out of the 5 principles to grasp. Around the top of page 23. Here's how I characterize the principle. Sri Ramakrishna's non-sectarian attitude allows him to accept the spiritual core of various philosophical sects without subscribing to all the doctrines of any sect in particular. This is a very subtle point.
This is hard at all. This is the best part of
well,
it
look
all.
at that. Okay.
Maybe because my past, but to be able to get to the core of a spiritual ideal or principle without having to buy into the dogma or doctrine of the whole of a whole religion. religion is like just so beautiful and honest.
Right.
I love it.
So this comes back to this challenge when you're reading the gospel. He's constantly referring to other schools of thought, constantly. This Mat, he would say, Mat means view or position or doctrine. He'll say, yeah, the Vaishnavas' Mat doctrine is this. The classical Advaitins' Mat, the doctrine is this. The Tantrics' doctrine is this. The Brahma Samaj doctrine is this. The Christians' doctrine is this. And whenever he does that, the impulse among many readers is to say that, see, he's referring to my doctrine, my school, and so therefore he's a tantric because he's approvingly referring to my doctrine. And then an Advaitin will read the same thing and say, no, he's approvingly referring to Nirvikapa Samadhi, which is a classical Advaitic doctrine. And then they start fighting with each other and saying that he belongs to my camp or my camp. And the Sri Ramakrishna knew that. But what is he doing? He's doing something much more subtle when he's referring to these schools. So my claim is, and I elevate this to an interpretive principle, the fourth interpretive principle. Just because he refers to a particular philosophical school doesn't mean that he's a card-carrying member of that school. It doesn't mean that he subscribes to all the doctrines of that school. Why do I think that? Because if that's what it meant, he would be falling into contradictions. Let me give you a concrete example. According to Shankara's school of classical Advaita Vedanta, ultimate reality, meaning Brahman, is only exclusively nirguna or nirvishesha, which means attributeless. Okay? That's a core doctrine of Shankara's school. What about Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta? Ramanuja says exactly the opposite, the diametrical opposite of that. Brahman is Vishnu Narayana only, exclusively with attributes. What are those attributes? The wonderful omni-attributes of the personal God. Omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving, right? Creator God. Directly conflicting with each other, Shankara's school and Ramanuja's school. Sri Ramakrishna in one place in the Gospel says, this is toward the bottom of page 22, and looking back, I used Nikalanji's translation. I should have gone back to the original Bengali here. It's slightly different. What I quote Nikalanji as saying, Shankara's Advaitic explanation of Vedanta is true, and so is the Vishittadvaitic interpretation of Ramanuja. He doesn't quite say that. In Bengali he says, Shankared Advaita Mat Ache, আর রামানুজের বিশিষ্টাদ্বৈত মত আছে. Ache in Bengali means there is. Asti in Sanskrit. Hey in Hindi, I think. So there is Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. There is also Ramanuja's. You see. And he's clearly implying that he accepts them. But in what way? It doesn't mean that he says that all the doctrines of both these schools are perfectly true. If he said that, he would say that, yeah, Shankara is right, that Brahman is only Nirguna. Ramanuja is also right that Brahman is only Saguna. That's crazy, because then he's really just saying that he's committing a contradiction. And that's just one of many examples that you can come up with. If he accepts Shankara's doctrine that this world is ultimately non-existent, and he also accepts Ramanuja's view that this world is a real manifestation of God, then again he's committing a contradiction, right? So I think what he's doing when he's referring to different philosophical schools is much more subtle. I think what he's doing is, when he says, I accept all paths, I accept Shankara's school, and I accept Ramanuja's school, and I accept Tantra, I accept Vaishnavism, I accept the Brahma Samaj, what I think he accepts is what I call the spiritual core of all of these different spiritual / philosophical traditions, without necessarily subscribing to all of the doctrines of all of these particular traditions. Particularly the exclusivistic, one-sided, fanatical, sectarian dimensions of these different schools. The moment that Shankara says Brahman is only this, or Ramanuja says it's only that, Sri Ramakrishna will say, I agree, Shankara, that Brahman is Nirguna, but drop the only. I don't accept the only. I agree with you, Ramanuja, that Brahman is Vishnu Narayana, but don't say only Vishnu Narayana. He can also be so many other things. I drop your only as well. I accept, you Tantrics, that Kali is obviously God and the supreme reality. But the moment you put Kali on a higher footing than Krishna, and he mentions this in one of these, in one place in the Gospel, he says that Vaishnavas and Shaktas have been going at it for centuries and calling each other names, and they play this game of higher and lower. And he mentions that the Shaktas, what they do is they say, yeah, you're saying that Krishna alone can ferry us across to the other shore of samsara? He says, yes. Kali she's much too great to be a ferry, like a boatman. So she leaves that job for Krishna. So this, as I said, there are definitely hierarchical elements in at least some texts in Tantra. I don't think that's really deniable.
If God is supposed to be omniscient and omnipotent, then it must be the spiritual core of all of them, right? So it doesn't matter. Like, it has to be the underlying thread.
For Sri Ramakrishna, at least. I mean, when he accepts different schools, I don't think that means that he accepts all the doctrines of Shankara and all the doctrines of Tantra and all the doctrines of Ramanuja, because he would end up falling into contradictions. No. So what do I mean? Like more specifically, what's the spiritual core of classical Advaita Vedanta? That Brahman is nirguna, attributeless, non-dual pure consciousness, and that we can realize that our true essence is that nirguna Brahman in the state of nirvikalpa samadhi. Fully accepts it. But he parts ways with classical Advaita the moment they say that Brahman is exclusively nirguna, and that Brahman can't also be Shakti. What about Ramanuja? He fully accepts what Ramanuja says, that Brahman is the personal God. But first of all, Brahman is not only Vishnu. There are so many other forms of the personal God, and even the formless personal God of the Brahma Samaj in Islam and Sikhism. And he also accepts Christ as an incarnation. These are things which Ramanuja is not going to go for. He won't accept any of this. And he also says, but wait, and there's a nirguna dimension to the ultimate reality, which you don't accept at all, O Ramanuja. But you should. Because nirguna Brahman is true too. You see, so he's very careful to, so the spiritual core of, you can say, of Vishishtadvaita, actually there are two things. One is about the nature of Brahman as the personal God as well. How does Sri Ramakrishna say this? Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. He beautifully reconciles Shankara and Ramanuja and the other Bhakti schools in that way. But what about the status of this world, which is an issue that we talked about at length in previous classes? He says, he also brings in Ramanuja at certain points. This is what confuses M. Because M thinks, well, the moment that Sri Ramakrishna goes to explain his understanding of the world, he brings in the bale fruit analogy, and that you can't take the whole weight of the bale fruit if you leave out the seeds in the shell. And then he says, Ramanuja believes this. Sri Ramakrishna himself, I quote this actually in the next book, in the book on Vivekananda. So M says, see, that means he's a follower of Ramanuja. I say no. He is drawing on the best aspects and the best elements and the most insightful aspects of each philosophy to explain his own much broader non-sectarian philosophy. So he agrees with Ramanuja that this world is not ultimately unreal, but is a real manifestation of Shakti. He agrees with Ramanuja on that. But he parts ways with Ramanuja when Ramanuja says that Brahman is only personal and not impersonal, right? So you can't say that he was I'm not sure that M had studied Vishishtadvaita very carefully, because if he had, he would have known that Ramanuja just simply doesn't accept the reality of Nirguna Brahman. He doesn't accept the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi in that sense. Do you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is an extremely important principle. So don't think just because he refers approvingly to a certain doctrine of a particular school means that he's a card-carrying member of that school. Vaishnavism, the whole gospel is full of Vaishnava themes, teachings. The moment he hears a Vaishnava song, he goes into samadhi and bhava. And Krishna, just by saying the word Krishna, he goes in the highest states of ecstasy. So, well, then he was a Vaishnava. Well, read Vaishnava philosophy and you'll find how hierarchical it is. If you're interested, I'm speaking online too. I wrote an essay recently, which will be published in a scholarly volume maybe next year, called Harmonizing the Impersonal Brahman with the Personal God, Sri Ramakrishna's Vijñāna Vedanta in dialogue with Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And I go it's a kind of in-depth study of Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy and its doctrines, and Sri Ramakrishna's Vijñāna Vedanta, and a comparative study. And what you'll find if you study the original text is it's full of hierarchies. Everything is hierarchical. There's always higher and lower. And I say that Sri Ramakrishna doesn't subscribe to that kind of hierarchical thinking, but there are, of course, affinities and similarities between these two schools of thought. Okay, and fifth and final interpretive principle. Again, I kind of already anticipated this, but I'm going to just repeat it. So this is page 26, middle of the page. Sri Ramakrishna's various philosophical teachings should be synthesized on the basis of a foundational concept or framework taught and accepted by Sri Ramakrishna himself. This is kind of like a cousin of interpretive principle 1 in a way, because it goes back to what Niranjan was pointing out, which is try to avoid eisegesis at all costs. Try to avoid reading your own ideas or ideas from other philosophical schools or doctrines into his teachings. If you can find, so the thing is, if you read the whole 1,200 pages of the gospel, ideally in the original Bengali, as I keep insisting, and you just cut and paste all of his teachings as a string, it's going to go into like a huge number of pages, and it's going to be a big mess. Because remember, he's talking in the course of conversations with different people. It's nothing systematic. There's no systematic arrangement, right? So how do we bring these teachings together? How do we relate them to one another? And one cop-out, one easy way out from an interpretive standpoint is to take the philosophical framework that you're most comfortable with. In Nishan's case, it's Tantra. In another person's case, it'll be classical Advaita, and say, yes. Let's take this framework, and then we'll arrange all of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings according to Shankara's school, or Abhinavagupta's school, or Chaitanya's school, or the list goes on. You see, what I'm saying is that becomes eisegetic. That's another case of reading an external framework into his teachings, which is not actually there. The better approach is to find certain teachings in the gospel, which are themselves foundational, which help us to organize and reconcile the other teachings that you find throughout the gospel, scattered across the over 1,000-page gospel. And I say that there is such a teaching. What is that teaching? His teachings on Vijñāna. Almost every page, he brings it up again and again and again and again. It's very striking. Why? He was a great mystic, and he was extremely practical, and he himself said, if you're going to a mango orchard, why bother counting all the leaves? You've come to eat mangoes, eat the mangoes for goodness sakes. So why does he spend so much time? Why does he spend so much breath teaching philosophy? This is a serious question. A lot of bhaktas they call themselves simple bhaktas, they say, Maharaj, why do you talk so much about philosophy? Because Sri Ramakrishna talks so much about philosophy. There are two texts which are very striking in being equally Brahma Vidya and Yoga Shastra. What are the two? Bhagavad Gita, the colophon at the end of each chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Brahma Vidyayam Yoga Shastre. 2 words. Brahma Vidya, it's the science of Brahman, which means it teaches the highest, loftiest philosophical and spiritual teachings. At the same time, it's a very practical spiritual manual. It's a Yoga Shastra. One can say exactly the same thing about the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. On the one hand, it's the highest Brahma Vidya. It's teaching the highest truths about spirituality, which will make our head spin. Why does he want us to get a headache? There's a reason for that. There's a reason why he doesn't just say you should pray and renounce lust and gold and this and that. No, he also constantly teaches philosophy because the two are inseparable. You see? So I think, he's like beating us over the head with Vijñāna for a reason. The reason is, hey, pay attention. Because it's through my teachings on Vijñāna that you can make sense of all of my teachings on spiritual practice. Not just that. All of my references to Shankara's school and Ramanuja's school and Vaishnava's school and Brahma Samaj's school. The only way to make sense of all these different teachings of mine is to first have a deep understanding and an accurate understanding and a rigorous understanding of my teachings on Vijñāna. That's why I call his philosophy Vijñāna Vedanta. At least that's the first half of it. That's why I call it Vijñāna Vedanta, because his teachings on Vijñāna are central, foundational for understanding all the rest of his teachings. Why do I call it Vijñāna Vedanta and not Vijñāna Tantra, for instance, which Nishant would have been more happy with? This is interesting. But this is interesting. And I've been asked this question before. There's another tantric friend of mine named Naren in North Carolina, and he asked me this. Well, why Vedanta? That's the one thing I disagree with. Vijñāna is more tantric than Vedanta. But why? And I give an answer. Maybe I'll anticipate this because we have a few minutes. Maybe we can. Okay, but
We have 1 minute, right?
no, it's 10:25, so we have a few more minutes. But page 29, bottom. I'm just kind of skipping ahead, fast forwarding a little bit. Do we need to? Or why don't we just go into the first tenet? Well, because this was my original plan for this class. I want to cover the first of the 6 tenets of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijñāna Vedanta. Then we have 5 remaining in the next class. So, those are the 5 overarching interpretive principles which I argue are necessary for properly understanding and interpreting Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical teachings on the basis of the Kathamrita, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Section 3, starting on page 27. The 6 central tenets of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijñāna Vedanta. And I promise I'll get to this issue of why I call it Vijñāna Vedanta, or remind me if I forget. Okay, but before I get there, look at the very first thing I say. I bring in this new term, which might be foreign to some of you, bhavamukha. Why might some of you not have even heard this term? Because the term is not found even once in the Gospel. But it's all over the place in another text, which is foundational in our tradition, which is called Lila Prasanga, written by Swami Sharanandaji, another great direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. The authoritative biography of Sri Ramakrishna is full of this concept of bhavamukha, not one reference to Vijñāna. And the Kathamrita is full of teachings on Vijñāna and not a single reference to bhavamukha. Now, there's one caveat there, qualification. In the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna does refer to bhava, in the sense of bhavamukha. No, not bhava samadhi. He actually says, he refers to his sadhana under Totapuri. When he was practicing Advaitic sadhana, he's in the state of Nirvikalpa samadhi for 6 months. And then he says, and then mother told me, bhabetaku. I think that's the original Bangla, bhabetaku. He uses bhava rather than bhavamukha, but it's the same concept. So that's the one place, as far as I'm aware, in the entire gospel, where he's using the word bhava in the sense of bhavamukha, where Divine Mother says, remain in the state of bhavamukha so that you can stay on this relative plane, not relative plane, that also is, again, we get this two-tier ontology, but stay in this world of lila, the plane of lila, so that you can help others out of their spiritual ignorance, be a vijnani rather than a jnani. So now one big philosophical question is, well, how does bhavamukha relate to vijnana? Big question. My claim is they're identical. And I'm not the first to claim this. Swami Tapasyananda has an entire article called What is Bhavamukha? And he makes a similar argument. I think if you look at what is the concept of bhavamukha in the Lila Prasanga, if you just look carefully at how it's understood, you'll see that what Sri Ramakrishna means is you come down from the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, you come back to this plane of Lila, and you sport with the personal God, and you see everything as a manifestation of God. Sometimes your mind will soar back into the Nirvikalpa plane, and you realize your true nature is non-dual consciousness. He says it's like you're running a boat race back and forth between the 7th and 6th planes, he says. That's bhavamukha, but that's exactly how he describes vijnana in the gospel. So that's my argument, my evidence for equating bhavamukha with vijnana. So that's the first question. Now, in terms of the first principle, well, at least start to tackle the first principle. Let me now get to it. Middle of page 27. Vijnana Vedanta 1. After attaining Brahma Jnana in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, ordinary people leave their body within 21 days. But certain divinely commissioned people known as Ishvarakotis are able to return from the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi and attain Vijnana, a spiritual state even greater than Brahma Jnana, in which perfect jnana and perfect bhakti are combined. There's a lot here and lots of cans of worms and lots of questions raised by this. Okay, imagine that somebody through tremendous spiritual practice attains the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. There are different routes that this soul can take after reaching that state. One possibility is, if you're an ordinary jiva, jiva koti, as he says, jeeb koti, he says, if you remain in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi for 21 days, what happens? Body drops off. Why? There's a simple physiological reason for it. Because there's no food. He's not taking any food. And if you don't take food or water for 21 days, body will automatically drop off. You'll say that's not healthy. Well, he's not even thinking about his body or her body, because that person has no body consciousness, completely transcended body consciousness. And the body itself, from the standpoint of classical Advaita, is a product of ignorance. So who needs the body, for goodness sakes? Sri Ramakrishna even says, suicide is only suicide so long as you have not realized God. But if you realize God and you leave the body, that's not suicide. I'm not encouraging anyone to commit suicide. Okay, don't. This whole context, remember the context principle.
Oh, so you were saying that when they stay in Nirvikalpa Samadhi for 21 days, not just having attained.
Very good. I think that's very good. That's a very subtle point. Because the thing is,
very confused
no. This is a very, very important point. And this is something that comes up again and every time I talk about these ideas, they say, well, but Advaita Vedanta, there's so many Advaita Vedantic Jivan Muktas, people who are still in the body but liberated. How do you explain them? One aspect of this is complicated, basically. The answer is complicated. One part of the answer is what we talked about last time, which is that classical Advaita Vedantins can't strictly accept Jivan Mukti. They have to posit avidya lesha, a trace of ignorance, even in the Jivan Mukta. That's one part of the answer. And that's linked to, I think, Sri Ramakrishna's answer to this question. Okay, like you can ask Totapuri. Totapuri had already realized Brahman before he came to Sri Ramakrishna. Did that make him an Ishvarakoti? One of the divinely commissioned souls? Was he a Vijnani? Clearly not, right? Why do I think that? Because he didn't accept Shakti. He would make fun of Sri Ramakrishna for clapping his hands in worship of Divine Mother, saying, what are you, making chapatis? Yeah. No, he didn't accept Shakti. He thought it was unreal. This world is a dream, right? Okay, so the thing is, here's a subtle point which Niranjana makes, which is, what Sri Ramakrishna says is, if somebody remains in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi for 21 days, then the body drops off. One simple way of explaining Advaitic, classical Advaitic Jivan Muktas is to say they can't stay in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi for 21 days. They come back within a shorter period of time. And in fact, that's true. Because if you look at, for instance, there's a wonderful book written by a previous Jagadguru of Sringeri Matha, so staunch followers of Shankara, Abhinavatita Swamigal. He's got this like chart where he explains, at this date, at this exact time, I entered the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And then 5 minutes or whatever minutes later, I come down from that state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Not 21 days. If it were 21 days, he would leave the body. But these Advaitic Jivan Muktas come back from the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi before the 21-day time period is over. You might ask why. Advaitins have an explanation. In fact, they distinguish 3 kinds of knowers of Brahman. These are just straight from classical Advaitic texts. There's Brahmavit. What is a Brahmavit? Somebody who attains the knowledge of Brahman in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, but is forced to come back to this plane, the relative plane. Now see, I'm using the 2-tier ontology because I'm talking within the framework of classical Advaita. Why are they forced to? Because of their own prarabdha karma. Their karma forces them to come back. And that karma itself is a product of ignorance, forcing them to come back to this unreal body and to see this unreal world. But there's a huge difference between the Jivan Mukta's perception of this world and the ignorant person's. What's the difference? I'm in this dream as a lucid dreamer, if I'm a Jivan Mukta. Everybody else is in a dream without knowing they're dreaming. And that's liberating, obviously. And that's why it's such a high state, a high spiritual. But it's not the highest for a classical Advaita Vedantin. The highest has to be Videha Mukti, which means you leave the physical body. Okay? So that's why it's the first stage of knowledge of Brahman. You reach Nirvikalpa Samadhi, you know Brahman, but you're forced to come back because of your own prarabdha karma. That trace of ignorance is dragging you back. Within an hour, within a day, before 21 days is up. One step up from that. Brahmavit, Varishta. No, Variyan first. Then Varishta is the highest. Variyan, second best. What's that? You go into the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, you realize you're Brahman, Aham Brahmasmi. How do you come back? Not because of your own prarabdha karma, but because somebody else will whisper in your ear, Hari Om Tat Sat, Hari Om Tat, or something. Sri Ramakrishna will often say, Ami Jal Kabo, when he comes back. He's bringing his mind down to the worldly plane by saying, I want to eat water. I have a desire to drink water, or give me a sweet. So that to bring his mind down. So somebody else has to bring your mind down. You on your own can't. That's why it's higher, because you're closer to the coveted goal of leaving the body altogether. And Brahmavid Varishta, the greatest knower of Brahman is who? Exactly maps onto what Sri Ramakrishna is saying. The person who attains the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, knows Brahman, gets stuck there. I say stuck, but that's negative. They want to get blissfully stuck there, because good riddance to this body. Who needs this body? I spat out my body, like Swamiji said at the end of his life. Videha Mukti is the highest ideal. Sri Ramakrishna fully accepts that from the classical Advaita. And he says that's the highest state for the ordinary jiva. For people who are not bhaktas. He says bhaktas want to eat sugar, they don't want to become sugar. So he says, I'm not saying that bhaktas have to eventually attain Nirvikalpa Samadhi. This is a separate issue and we can talk about it. But he says it very clearly in one place in the gospel when Mohima Chakravarti asks, but bhaktas also have to attain Nirvikalpa Samadhi, don't they? In Nirvana, he calls it Nirvana. He says, no, there's such a thing as the eternal Krishna and eternal bhaktas. Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham. Krishna is eternal and his abode is also eternal. Okay? And I'm going to end with, as I said, fulfilling my promise, Vedanta. But there's actually, I'm going to, in the next class, which is on the 17th, note that we're skipping a week. I'm going to review a few things that I didn't talk about in Doctrine 1, and then we'll go forward from there. But one thing I want to bring your attention to, bottom of page 29. Why do I call Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy Vijñāna Vedanta? Because Sri Ramakrishna himself gives hints throughout the gospel that his own teachings on Vijñāna can be found in Vedantic scriptures. That's why. Let me give you an example. Look at the bottom. What I write is Sri Ramakrishna explains that the superior devotee, Uttam Bhakta, another term for a Vijñāni, quote, sees that God alone has become everything. This is the Vijñāni idea. The Vijñāni sees that Brahman alone has become everything. And he then immediately adds, notice, read the Gita, the Bhagavata, and the Vedanta, and you will understand all this. That's why. Again, you might say, well, that's because you like Vedanta and that's why you're making him a Vedanta. No, it's because he likes, it's not just he likes everything. But he specifically says, you can trace back my teachings on Vijñāna to Vedantic scriptures. Bhagavad Gita is one of the core scriptural pillars of Vedanta, one of the Prasthana Traya. Bhagavata Purana is one of the key Vedantic scriptures in the Vaishnava tradition. And he specifically used the word Vedanta, by which he means, I think, Upanishads and things like that. Yeah.
But doesn't he distinguish Vedanta Purana from Vedanta Purana Tantra? Does he not? His mother showed me what is in the Vedanta.
That's true.
Purana and Tantra.
That doesn't mean that when he's referring to the Bhagavata that it's not a Vedantic text. It's a Vedantic scripture. Obviously, it's a kind of it's called Vaishnava Vedanta. I mean so it's not that they're mutually exclusive. Achintya Bheda Veda Vedanta is the philosophical basis of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, right? And their main foundational scripture is the Bhagavata Purana. Yeah, but they fully accept all the Vedantic scriptures, and yeah. So that's why. Why doesn't he say read the Chandi? I think because he thinks that there are sectarian elements in these texts. In the Vaishnava script, he says it, Bhaktamal. It's one of these Bengali Vaishnava scriptures that says, Bhaktamal is great, full of devotion for Krishna, but it's one-sided, aghe. Kintu aghe. I think he'd probably say the same thing about some of these tantric texts. It's wonderful. His Ishtadevata, his chosen deity was Kali. How could he not like Tantra? But there are some sectarian elements there, as he himself mentions. Whereas Vedanta, if you read Gita, that's the whole purpose of this class. Let's try to study the Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Why? He's already giving hints in certain places. How do you read the Bhagavad Gita itself in a non-sectarian way? Don't rely on the sectarian commentators, as Swami Medhananda said. Let's bring in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijñāna. The non-sectarian Vijñāna Vedanta philosophy alone, I think, can give us the tools for interpreting the Bhagavad Gita in a fully non-sectarian manner. Okay, any last questions?
This was a great class.
Let's just say three minutes remaining. So any lingering questions? Yeah.
Let's say someone read Swamiji, only the English works of Swamiji, in the proper chronology, and they were a very competent student. Okay, would they need to read the Gospel at all? Would they have to read the Katamrita, or can they understand everything there is to understand in the Katamrita from Swami Vivekananda's English works alone?
No. Simple answer, no. Yeah. So there's one, I think, very facile explanation of the relationship between Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, which is often parroted, which is using these traditional terms from Indian philosophy. Sri Ramakrishna's teachings are the Shruti, which means the foundational scripture, like tantamount to the Vedas. Swami Vivekananda is the Bhashya or the Smriti. I think they say Bhashya, which means the commentary on the Shruti, on Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. I don't think that's wrong, but it's more complicated than that. And I think the reverse of what you said is actually more true, which is that we can only understand Swami Vivekananda's teachings properly in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, and not the other way around. Because one of the reasons is Swami Vivekananda, most of what we find in the 9-volume complete works are lectures that he gave in the West for a Western audience, primarily Christian, and some New Age spiritualist types. And right? What does that mean? So the thing is, that's a completely different context. He's writing in English. He specifically tells his brother disciples, I don't preach Sri Ramakrishna in the West, because that's not what they need. They already have their Christ. So how in the world is that going to help us to understand Sri Ramakrishna's teachings? You can if you read between the lines, but it's a very subtle project, and that's why I wrote a separate book. Some monks asked me, why didn't you talk about Swami Vivekananda in your first book? I said, because that's a separate issue, and I'm not going to... It's called begging the question in philosophy. That's actually used technically. It would be begging the question to assume that what Swami Vivekananda taught is exactly the same thing that Sri Ramakrishna taught. Prove it on the basis of evidence. How do I do it? With 2 different books. First book on Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy and his teachings, and I give a certain interpretation, Vijñāna Vedanta. Next book is Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism. In the first 3 chapters, I'm making an extended case on the basis of textual evidence that Swami Vivekananda, the kind of Advaita philosophy he taught in the West and in India, consistently, with some exceptions, was basically the Vijñāna Vedanta. He just doesn't use the term Vijñāna, and I call it integral Advaita. It's an all-encompassing oneness, which is exactly what Sri Ramakrishna's Vijñāna is. Okay? Yeah, good. Thank you so much. So see you on the 17th of September, Sunday, 9:30 to 10:30. Thank you so much for contributing this class. That's what makes this class come alive. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.